We're getting started a little bit late because of the baseball game tonight. We've heard that parking has been a little bit challenging. If anyone is interested in moving forward, there's two really good reasons for you to do that. One, that our latecomers can have seats in the back, but also our newest chairs are in the front. I'm serious about this. So the closer you sit, the more comfortable you will be. We're a nonprofit, and we have to make our choices.
It's very nice of you.
See? Endorsements. So thank you for coming tonight. I'm Terry Schwartz, and on behalf of the College of Architecture at Kent State, I just want to welcome you to the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative. It's a really exciting time for the college. If you have free time tomorrow, I hope you'll make your way to Kent for the grand opening of our new building. The College of Architecture has a shiny new building, and the festivities start tomorrow at 3. But we're glad that you're here with us tonight for our 5th in the series of future city sessions. The Gunn Foundation gave us a grant about a year ago to convene these conversations. It is, kind of a lecture series, of course, but really more importantly than just a straightforward lecture, we're trying to make discoveries in conversation. And so for tonight, Charles is going to talk for about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we have a wonderful panel here who are going to sort of expand on some of the topics that Charles introduces. Charles is one of the editors of the Third Coast Atlas that's forthcoming toward the end of this year or early next. And then we have 5 people who actually contributed to the publication, along with Steve Litt, who's going to moderate our conversation. Following all of that, we'll have opportunity for questions, answers, discussion with all of you. I also want to thank Jeff Kruth, who's really been running all of our future city sessions, the technical aspects and otherwise. As I mentioned, this is the 5th. It may be the final. I think that if we can squeeze a little bit of money out of that budget, we may do a 6th one toward the end of the year. I hope so, that we can have it rounded out with 6 sessions. We've covered everything from big data to climate variability, aging in cities, and then tonight, of course, we're going to be focusing on the opportunities presented by being in the Great Lakes Basin. I will introduce the panelists right before we start the panel. I do want to mention, though, that we're live streaming on Facebook, so if any of you are watching from your computer and you'd like to be part of the conversation, what you need to do is text CUDC on your phone, and then to this number, 22333. And that'll open up a channel so that you can post questions so that we can present them to Charles and the panel. So I want to say hello if anyone is watching in the Cube in our new architecture building. Apparently it's streaming down there. As well. So Charles Waldheim first came to visit us about 10 years ago. I guess you're on a visit every decade, and so we're glad you're back. In 2006, Charles was here when we were beginning to think about population loss and urban vacancy. Charles' book, Stalking Detroit, really was and continues to be a really major influence on the way that we think about our city as it goes through some rather dramatic transitions. Currently, though, Charles is at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University, where he is the director of the Office for Urbanization, which is a 2-week-old organization, a brand new, just hatched organization. And then, as I mentioned, he's co-editor of the Third Coast Atlas. So if you all would join me in welcoming Charles.
Thank you, Sarah, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be back in Cleveland. There's so many people on the street. It's incredible. My flight in from Boston this afternoon was sprinkled with people that I took to be wives and girlfriends of the team. I arrived at the Schofield Hotel very excitedly because my Cleveland friends told me it's new and they all want to see it. And so I arrived and they looked at my driver's license and they said, "You can't stay here. You're from Massachusetts. It's not going to be okay." So we're going to be strictly nonpartisan. You will be out by the first pitch at 8 p.m., I promise you. It's nice of you to turn out, and it's a pleasure to be back here in Cleveland at the CUDC. Each decade that I'm here, you have larger, more prosperous surroundings. And so I'm thinking of my little startup at the GSD, in which we have 2 employees and a tiny little office space. And I'm looking longingly at the staff and the space and the work that you've done over here for many years. So it's really a pleasure to be back and to see some of my co-conspirators. The most important thing to say is that the work I'm going to present is not mine. It's a book project that's been about 10 years in the making. It's the result of the work of 40 migrant intellectual laborers working on both sides of the US-Canadian border. And it's, as much as anything else, it's a sequel to the book that Terry mentioned that was called Stalking Detroit. About 15 years ago, I did this book on Detroit with Jason Young and Georgia Deskalakis, which was looking at what are the conditions for urbanization in that city in the 1990s. As a sequel to that, my colleagues and I have been working on this project called Third Coast Atlas for the last couple of years with a similar aspiration to describe, well, what are the conditions in which we're working in the basin? What are the conditions for urbanization here, and how might we describe that in the context of a publication? I'll say a little bit more about we in a moment, but I wanted to start with this image, which is, as much as anything else, my favorite map in the book. It's a book of maps. It's 400 pages of maps and many, many other things that I'll mention briefly. But this map for me is really quite telling. This is a drawing from 1879. It's attributed to the U.S. Army's survey of the northern and western lakes. In the 1840s, the U.S. Congress commissioned this survey as a part of a colonial project, really a project of nation building, to construct both navigable waterways but also defensive points along the way. This was, of course, after centuries of colonization of the region. But what I love about this map is how spare it is. I love how much is left out of the map. It's very simple. A few simple set of lines. I'll say a little bit more about the Lake Survey project. Between 1841, the funds were appropriated. 1879, this final publication was made public. But for me, this is the first map, historically, that really begins to try to triangulate and tie together what had been very, very different regions. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. My co-editors who couldn't be here this evening include Claire Lister at the University of Illinois, Chicago, Mason White at the University of Toronto, and my doctoral candidate, Daniel Ibanez at the Graduate School of Design. So the four of us, along with 36 contributors who contributed essays and projects and maps, worked with a range of photographers. The publisher is Actar of Barcelona, Sienna Scarf Design out of Cambridge, collaborated with us, and the Grant Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts in Chicago funded the publication, among other things. What you're seeing here are proofs. This is our third round of proofs. The color's not quite right. We have an event in Barcelona in 2 weeks where we'll see finally print proofs. We've been doing all this electronically, and the book will be released at some point in December, and it'll be made available first week in year 3. So we're calling it a prelude to a plan, to indicate that we do believe that there's something to be said about planning in the region, something to be said about urbanization in the region, and that while the region is, of course, incredibly diverse and has many, many different things going on in it, there might be some value, some interest in looking at it as a territory or as a region. And in that, you can see here a dozen essays, one on each of the major cities in the region, a dozen essays on themes that I'll say something about. Keller Easterling from Yale University was nice enough to offer us a brief foreword. And so Easterling puts the book in the context of the language that we use to talk about cities. So Easterling's foreword begins with the idea that most often, if we talk about urbanization, we appropriate a language that we've inherited from finance, from global finance, from a neoliberal economy of finance, and in which she argues it's important for us to use our own tools so as to be able to talk both in terms of finance and economy, but equally in terms of design and design culture, design maps, and this kind of thing. As we did with Stalking Detroit, one of our goals is, before we give a diagnosis or before we write a prescription, to simply try to describe what's going on here, given that we know that there's so many very interesting people working in the region, so many interesting projects. One way that we go about that is with a series of photographic folios. So the book is broken into various sections, and we include these photographic folios, in this case, a range of images from NASA's Earth imaging programs. They have many programs, as you know, for studying the Earth from satellite and to look at water quality, to look at environmental change over time. And so these brief folios you'll see from a range of photographers, beginning with NASA, break up the book into a variety of sections. And for us, the book is meant to be consumed as an atlas, hundreds and hundreds of maps. It's meant to be something that's a reference work. It doesn't mean to be read from the beginning to end. At 400 pages and 40 contributors, it's more of a reference work and atlas to be returned to. And so we began in the first section of the book called Projections to simply try to understand the region through water, through the watershed. As you know, it's the largest collection of fresh water on the planet, about a fifth, 20% of the world's fresh water. In the context of that, a range of urbanized regions, each with their own specific dynamics, but collectively, it's also a shoreline and a coastline and a territory that in some ways we wanted to position as its own new country, right? So you remember the old maps of Europe that had Czechoslovakia? And in geography, you'd kind of like, what is that shape? What is that country? If you just saw it as an outline. Of course, you know, the East and the West Coasts have reputations as being sites of production, right? And in my experience, I spent most of my career in this region, in Chicago and in Toronto. Most of my career I spent in flyover country here in the midsection, with the expectation by many that the East and West Coasts produced and we consumed. And I think that's a bit of a caricature, but that certainly was my experience for 20 years or more. And so a part of what we're trying to do here is simply to describe the region on its own terms as if it were its own country. Like, what would that mean? Just for a minute. Because we know, obviously, that political boundaries don't correspond to hydrological or geographic boundaries. But within that, the idea that we could claim this territory as its own region and think about it and study it was its own polemic in a way. Before we get to diagnosis, before we get to prescription, simply the idea that that territory would become legible, that the watershed territory of the basin and its inhabitants and its various political jurisdictions might be legible. Of the three terrestrial photographers, you might say, we include work by Robert Burley. Burley is a Toronto-based photographer that I've worked with on many projects. He has a series of Great Lakes projects that he's been doing over the last several years. And his images get at something of the horizon or something of the absence of horizon, something of the kind of atmospheric quality in this region. Burley is working in a very strong landscape painting tradition, right? The horizon is always 3/5 of the way up the frame. There's a very kind of strong compositional structure here, right? In this next section we call potentials, we were interested to commission academic scholars, professionals, a range of people from different fields, most of whom are working in the region, some are not, to look at thematic issues. Foregrounded what we think of as 12 thematic issues that might be relevant to doing work in the region. The first of that is a piece by my colleague Pierre Belanger from the GSD called Regionalization. And it's a little bit like Keller Easterling's giving a kind of theoretical frame, a kind of intellectual frame to what it means to work in the context of a region. And between our introduction, Keller Easterling's foreword, and Belanger's essay on regionalization, a part of what we're trying to do is re-enter the topic of the region. Right? On the one hand, we now live in a world that our disciplines, our colleagues tell us, is effectively global or planetary in its scale of urbanization. If you've followed the work of Hashim Sarkis, my colleague who's now at MIT, or Neil Brenner, who's joined us at the GSD, it's effectively arguing, much of contemporary discourse, that urbanization is now a global phenomenon. It's impossible to distinguish a part of the world that is not urbanized, whether that's on the topic of carbon, or whether it's on the topic of a range of other issues. In that regard, re-entering the region is its own, I think, intellectual project. I think it's important to do it with a kind of historical literacy about that issue. At the same moment, we know that there's no easy return to a kind of naive sense of region vis-a-vis its ecological construct. We have an extraordinary contribution by Jeff Mana and Anya Tomleski, which looks at the geology, the kind of longer durée history of the region. Kathy Velikov, Jeffrey Thune from the University of Michigan offer extraordinary introduction to their own work, looking at the region through a series of sheds of urbanization. Michael Etzbon and Jan van der Groot do a piece on portage and portaging through the region, a nice essay they contributed. And I'm only showing you the frontispiece image and the title. These are longer, 3,000 to 5,000 word essays that are quite substantive and I think will contribute. Sean and Karen give us this extraordinary piece on reclaiming the littoral. And if you want to get into the weeds with me, I've been copy editing for a couple of weeks, so there are at least 3 ways to spell littoral. And right now in these proofs, we're spelling it all 3 ways. And it will be 2 T's, I promise you. If you notice the text is very well copied, and the titles need some work. Alyssa North from the University of Toronto has a piece on cutting the corporate lawn. It's not about law, it's about the lawn. So I'm deep in copy editing mode. Mark attempted this extraordinary piece on the US-Canada border, right? It's kind of piracy on the third coast, piracy around the world's longest undefended border. And Maria did this extraordinary thing on the cycles of water in the region. Thanks for being here and doing this. Rosetta Elkin, my colleague at the GSD, did a piece on the salt dome under the region geologically and the kind of geological underpinnings and the prevalence of a salt economy. Rania Gosen El-Hadi Vizari did this nice piece of the Great Waste State, looking at the region's consumption of other people's refuse, focusing on Michigan, among other places. Martin Felsen from IIT did a nice piece on the idea of planning around fresh water. And then finally, Phil Lindquist, of course, who's also been active in this space from a very different position about the work, but at the same moment, we thought it was important to recognize his work, and we included in the final essay in this section his 100-year vision for what the region might be. So those are kind of thematic essays, many people that have been working in the region for many, many years, that give us a sense of, well, these are the kinds of themes and issues that people have been engaged in. We have a portfolio, another Toronto-based photographer, Edward Burtynsky. Burtynsky, while he's better known for his post-industrial porn, he's really extraordinarily good also effectively at describing the conditions of water in and around Ontario. And these images of uranium tailings in Ontario, for me, are just among the most kind of heartbreaking but breathtaking images. So he's using conventions of landscape photography in a way to get at the kind of complexities of a post-industrial heritage, in this case with uranium tailings among other things. The next section of maps we're calling profiles. And in the profile section, we looked more at the occupation of individual cities, right? So we're looking at the macropolitan, the micropolitan. We're looking at metropolitan regions. We're also looking at individual city centers and cores. We wanted to be able to do enough of that to have a fine-grained enough kind of analysis. And so among the tools that we use, you see here these diagrams of land use around the region, which we found interesting and instructive in a way to try to describe how we occupy the region. And then we use these land use diagrams here to try to get at, on the one hand, what's shared, what's comparable across the region, because overwhelmingly the cities in the region have been located around river mouths and river mouths around portage and coastal portage in relationship to transit and shipping. But at the same moment, a whole series of industrial uses have sprung up, and at the same time, they take different configurations and different intensities in different parts of the region. Having said that, there are some overwhelming commonalities that can shape and influence our thinking about this part of the work. Finally, we have a portfolio by Alex McLean. Alex McLean is the Boston-based aerial photographer who's been doing work in the region for about 25 years. And we've selected a portfolio of a few of his images which get at the edge condition. The edge condition, which is almost always industrialized, almost always a very complex mix of industrial use and kind of material ecologies, right? So industrial sorting on the one hand, immediately adjacent to this lacustrine ecology, which is its own ongoing dynamic set of conditions. Under prospects, under this next section of the book, we thought it would be interesting to invite individual contributors from each of the largest cities in the region to talk in some detail, given their experience over many years, many decades for many of them, about the conditions for urbanization in their cities. We wanted to identify, while not all of them are academics, people that were either academics, public figures, journalists, people that were sufficiently unencumbered, let's say, by official responsibilities working within any particular sausage making, so as to be able to describe, well, what's going on in Chicago? So Bob Brugman offers a piece on the city of Chicago, what's been going on there in the last 10 or 15 years. And in each one of these, we have a shorter essay, 2,000 to 3,000 words, and we have a kind of timeline device over here. I don't know if you can make that out, but for each of these, we try to describe population growth beginning in 1800 through 2010 over here, and signal events, like primary events with respect to the urbanization of that particular city. At the top left, you'll see a kind of spark line. If you know Ed Tufte's spark lines, right? So there's a Tufte-esque spark line here that looks at, in dark black, municipal population, in light gray, beginning in 1950, metro area population. And you can see at the top here, that asterisk, that's 1950. where urbanization crested municipal area, but also began to explode metro area in most cities. So that just gives us a sense of, okay, in a comparative way, what's going on in each of these. James Wasley gave us a nice piece on Milwaukee's inner harbor and the conditions in Milwaukee. Detroit, a piece by Jerry Heron, who's contributed to Talking Detroit earlier, looking at Detroit's extraordinary explosion in the first half of the 20th century, its equally precipitous decline. And then Toledo, looking at Katerina Louis-Ray, looking at Toledo's kind of faltering recovery vis-a-vis, again, the automobile industry. You'll notice each of the maps in the books, in the book sections, but equally each of the essays, they're organized based on water flow. So we try to follow the water flow through the region. So we're always beginning upland, we're always beginning in Superior, and then moving eventually through the St. Lawrence, ultimately to the Atlantic Ocean. And it's a curious way to organize a book, but it's been interesting for us as editors to think that way, to try to understand that way. Of course, the reversal of the Chicago River, which means that Michigan goes through the Mississippi, is its own kind of conundrum that we've been trying to puzzle through. In this regard, Terry's piece on Cleveland vacancy, hydrology, redevelopment is a central piece for us. Thank you so much for doing this. I know that these things take an enormous amount of time, but we're depending upon not only our own perspective on things from a distance, but also people that have been working in cities and in the region for decades for their career. And so we're trying to gather together both a cohort of 40 people that we think of as co-conspirators to have this conversation, but at the same moment, trying to connect them in a way to data, information, maps, graphics, which can be more comparative in a way. So here we have Cleveland with its own history that you know better than I do, its own extant recovery. Now, admittedly, being here on the first night of the divisional playoff round is an exceptional evening. Having said that, it seems different. The last time I was here, the flats were abandoned. The time before that, the flats were a new idea, right? So it's interesting to see how the fabric is still here, but every time I come back to Cleveland, there is more happening. And I know that there's a longer story that we'll get into about Cleveland's recent history. Richard Summer, my colleague from Toronto, has done a piece on Toronto, which has now eclipsed Chicago as the kind of dominant city by certain measures in the region. Syracuse, Julia Zerniak, who's working in the Finger Lakes, University of Syracuse. Montreal, Nick Luca, Heather Braden did a piece on Montreal's recovery. We include in the book, we thought it was important to situate this as an atlas in a historic context. So we include two historic portfolios of maps, the first of which you see here. This is, we're calling it Mapping the Third Coast between the middle of the 17th century to the middle of the 19th century, so 1643 to 1837. And so just a sample of these dozen maps here. It struck us that the region could be described in some way as itself a kind of cartographic project. And so our editorial position is that it was only through the construction of these maps, it was only through the mapping of the territory that the region could be construed as such. It's not as though there was a region here to be found. It's not as though there was a region extant that could be discovered in some way or inhabited. It was in fact a colonial project and then ultimately a national project of state construction through the US Lake Survey that really allowed the region to be described as a territory. And so we were interested to describe in chronological terms, beginning with French colonization, some of the earlier maps, which of course follow the French format, working beginning at the river mouth, in this case the St. Lawrence, and then mapping with decreasing fidelity in contemporary terms to what the interior hinterland might be, right? So this describes, of course, a process of colonization, but it's also a cartographic process that you can begin to see. And we were hoping that by describing that with a series of maps, you can see here this extraordinary map of the New France, right? The map of the mouth of the St. Lawrence, the maritime provinces, is quite faithful in a way to contemporary understandings, but also begins to lose coherence. By the time you get to Superior, it's not clear what's going on here. Of course, California is gone entirely, separated entirely the bottom, right? So we thought that was interesting to juxtapose with some more contemporary cartography, right? A consolidation of the territory of the region. You begin to see in the middle of that 2-century process things that look like this, where, yeah, Ontario, Erie, Huron, Michigan, Superior begin to go here and begin to be connected to, obviously, the great midsection of the Mississippi here, right? And so in maps like this, you begin to see a region of the New France or Canada emerge. It's also in maps like this that this curious inversion is very legible. Of course, you know, Lower Canada, referring to Quebec, is the French term of art describing Quebec and the eastern reaches of the St. Lawrence. Of course, Lower Canada is north of Upper Canada, which is here, Ontario, right? So in that consolidation, we also track the shift away from French colonial project to the faltering of the French project and the emergence of the British aspirations for colonies, right? The kind of Napoleonic question, the selling of the Louisiana Purchase, but equally the consolidation of the project of Canada as a British colonial territorial project. In so doing that, you can see here the British mapping, the definitive mapping of Upper and Lower Canada, that is, of Ontario and Quebec. And in using that, we're trying to situate a territory to talk about the construction of the region as its own historical project, its own political project, its own set of ambitions that we can talk about. We find it important to try to describe urbanization in project-based terms, and so we have, in the back third of the book, we have a section called Plans. And there was a moment in this, in working with my co-editors, Claire and Danny Mason, that they said, you know, would it be interesting or possible for us to try to gather every urban project in the last 15 years in the region? And I kind of slumped and said, I'm not sure I'm up for that, you know. I'm deep in middle age and aging rapidly, and I'm not sure, you know, the book's already taken a few years, let's try to actually land this plane. But they eventually persuaded me that it might be just the audacity of that project. And so we've been gathering the last several years in this section called Plans, everything that we could find, a good faith effort. If you have other things, please bring them forward. A good faith effort to try to gather in the watershed, so anything within the watershed area, wherever a drop of water falls and lands in the lakes, an urban project, so something at the scale of the block structure or bigger, without any editorial filter, so unconditional positive regard, a project that was proposed. We're setting aside also whether that project was realized or not. We're setting aside any judgment about quality. We're simply saying, these are the 400 or so urban projects that we've found in the last 15 years in the region that we think might be pertaining to characterizing what's going on here. And we use that as a lens to feed into our introductory essay, to try to describe, well, what seems to be going on here, and are there ways that we can describe it that are distinct? And then finally, this lake survey, which is where I want to conclude my remarks and then open up to our conversation. As I mentioned, we think of the region as something that was a construction. We think of it as something that didn't exist a priori to be inhabited or stumbled into. We think that that was a project of colonization, it was a project of economy and commerce, of various peoples and communities, the conversations of their experience. But it was also something that was consolidated in a project of national construction, both in the US and the Canadian side. In this regard, we found it interesting that in 1841, the US Congress commissioned the US Army and a wing of the US Army, the topographic engineers that would eventually form a part of the Corps of Engineers later in the 19th century, to execute this survey of the northern and western lakes. It's the scale and the audacity of this project that I'm really drawn to. On the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, this 1879 map of Captain Molitor is a remarkable end product, but it's at the end of 3 decades of work, 3 decades of expedition and fort building, but also mapping in a kind of very tough set of environments. So I want to mention a couple of things in that regard that I find compelling about these. Just pause a moment and let that load.
Yes.
or not. If you could just pull up that one map, that would be useful. And so where I wanted to get to, was this idea that on the one hand, the book project itself is meant to be, as much as anything else, a kind of an index and a resource. So in an age where almost everything is available electronically, it's all available online, we thought that there would be something interesting and slightly perverse about producing a 400-page, very large trim-size, full-color atlas that one could refer to. So we're acknowledging on the one hand that there's something specific about that, but also, as much as anything else, to use the project to gather people together to have a conversation about what that means. To situate, on the one hand, a theoretical conversation about, well, what does it mean to recuperate the category of the region? Is there any value in that today? What are the challenges associated with doing that? On the other hand, what might be the potentials of that? At the same moment, to try to argue for projects of regionalization or regional identity as necessarily self-constructed. That is, they don't exist a priori. That is, we don't inhabit a region unless we agree that we do so, and if so, we have to do things to activate that, and to occupy that region in certain ways. And so by concluding the book with this US Lake survey, I wanted to, in some way, remind us of the idea that as a constructed activity, we were meant to imagine the region as something, and then therefore engage in activities that it's constructed as such. And in that sense, the work that the Corps of Engineers and Topographic Engineers did is remarkable in my mind, in part because of the fidelity of individual pieces of the maps, but that ultimately that one map that you'll see momentarily is really distilled down to a very, very simple set of lines, right? So on the one hand, you see over the course of 2 centuries, what was originally a French monarchic crown project distills itself down to ultimately the bureaucracy of the US government, and that was a project that included the topographic arts, it included surveying, but it was primarily, amongst other things, concerned with it was concerned with, of course, not only defensible points and forts at Detroit and Buffalo and Chicago, but equally it was concerned with navigable waterways. By the end of the 19th century, there were 20,000 of these maps being reproduced annually, because every navigable vessel needed to have one of these, right? Because it was primarily concerned with, thank you so much, I'll try not to break it again. What I want to say here has to do, again, with like the heraldic intentions have been distilled down to a very modest, almost kind of bureaucratic sense compared to the kind of grandeur of the French project. Secondly, if you look at how much is left out, there are no urbanized areas, there are no cities. There's no sense of landscape feature at all, just parchment. There is a set of lines, of course, latitude and longitude lines that situate us. There's the frame that situate those latitude and longitude lines. You can see the fine-grained filigree of the line of the boundary of the lakes. And more importantly, and if in fact I can advance the slide one more, I'll show you in just a moment, the river-lake interface, which was very faithfully, very carefully rendered. This was not a map of cities or urbanization, it was a map to enable the region to be occupied as such, to make it inhabitable. Another set of lines I find equally compelling are these triangulation lines here. And so this is, in 1879, the conclusion of the Lake Survey, the kind of heroic, territorial, almost continentally scaled effort to tie these points together, literally through a kind of mesh. On the one hand, that mesh is as contemporary as the Architectural Association's landscape urbanism 10 years ago, right? It's a completely contemporary set of images, but at the same moment, it's tying together aspects of a drawing that already had been done at a different scale. These maps began in very small fragments, and then eventually, in this case, in the 1840s, Lake Erie emerged as the first full lake published. And they did this over the course of decades. It was like every 15 years, oh, there's a new lake available, right? And so, for me, the idea that this was a project, that Lake Huron came on next. It is true that there's more detail on the US side than on the Canadian side generally. Lake Michigan was published in 2 halves, northern first and then southern secondly. And if the southern half of Lake Michigan will load in a moment, you can see here, this is just a detail in which the bathymetry of the southern end of Lake Michigan and the harbor approach, the entry and the positions of lighthouses. This is an active political program to build the infrastructure that would allow the region to be urbanized, among other things, to be inhabited, to enable commerce, among other things. And so when you purchase the book, you'll find that there's a lovely set of drawings of Lake Superior. Lake Ontario comes on relatively late, but you can see that the focus on bathymetry, the focus on the kind of river-lake interface, much more so than anything terrestrial, the land almost goes away. And that inversion I find quite compelling. And if you hang in with me, there's one more image that's going to show Cleveland. There's Chicago, you can see the mesh. And so there we are. And so you have this strange world, which is 1879. They're not only producing a map to enable us to inhabit the waterways and therefore to inhabit the region, they're showing their work at the same moment, right? Because they're allowing people who can understand the mathematics and the topographic work to see the region as constructed. And for me, I've been interested to think about this mesh in some ways as being more important to this project of regional construction than the latitude and longitude or many of the other references that Mike did. So thanks everybody for coming out. Look forward to chatting with you about this. And I think I'll turn it back to you, Terry, and then we'll introduce the panel.
I will do that. Thank you. Sort of spin your chairs. We're very low tech here at the CADC. So our panel tonight is being moderated by Steve Litt. We have been talking with Steve about Great Lakes issues for a long time, and it was 3 years ago now that Steve organized a really important and interesting event with Phil Enquist around the Great Lakes Sanctuary, where we began to be thinking about like our place in this larger basin. Other folks on our panel include our dear friend Sean Burkholder, who I still consider a CUDC employee, even though he's been gone for a long time. He still knows the password to our server, but he's on faculty at the University of Buffalo in urban design and landscape architecture. Comes back to visit now and again. And then to my right is Jen McGritt and Maria Arquero de Alarcon from the University of Michigan, who we have had the good fortune to get to know over the years. We have a shared interest in Great Lakes hydrology. So with that, I think, Steve, do you want to kind of kick it off with a compelling question?
Yeah, sure. I feel like I should stand so that people in the back of the room could see me. First of all, Charles, I want to say how stimulating it has been to see this project laid out, and I'm going to run out and buy a copy. Let me know. I'll push the button as soon, midnight, the night it's available. I'd like to know how many other people in the room feel that way. Is this a really urgent thing? You really want to get a copy of this? Yes? Okay. So, Charles, I wanted to start off just by asking a little bit more about the backstory here. Why did you feel this work was necessary, and who needs to know this information? Where's the demand coming from? Who wants to think about the Great Lakes as a region, cross borders, if we imagine the Phil Enquist idea of erasing all the borders? Who's pushing that, and why did you feel it was necessary to pursue that, and why did your colleagues have the same sense?
Thanks, Steve. So the origin for me was when I'm trained as an architect and urbanist. I work on cities. And I was very fortunate at the beginning of my academic career. I got a teaching job at the University of Michigan, and I arrived in Detroit and found the toolkit that I had been given, like the work I had done, all the professional and academic training was just utterly inadequate. So this was a long time ago. This was 20 years ago. And this was at a time before our colleagues in Ann Arbor really began to focus on Detroit as a locus, a long, long time ago. And through that, and through collaboration with my colleagues there, two things happened. One is we started this project that ultimately became Stalking Detroit, which for me was a process of, because I realized my tools were inadequate. Simply more buildings were not going to be the solution, apparently. Two things happened. One is I realized, and my colleagues realized, before we do what architects typically do, which is propose a solution, which is what I've been trained to do, which is produce even more architecture, I had to stop and more adequately describe the condition. And so the Stalking Detroit project, which in a way is the kind of sister project to the Third Coast Atlas, started that process for me, which was a kind of radical thing for me. And it seems strange to say it this way, but the idea that an architect or an urbanist would stop and simply describe things. I mean, when that book first came out, many of my colleagues and friends found that we were essentially apologizing for political, economic, social failures. But I found it in my own work really valuable to simply describe the condition as such before getting to a diagnosis. The second thing that happened was I was radicalized and began a process of radicalization around landscape. But for me, landscape emerged in a way I had no education in landscape at that time. And so for me, landscape emerged. And so as I spent my career in Chicago and Toronto, I found myself inhabiting, my kid was born in this region. I spent the better part of my career, my life here. Great institutions, great people, and yet each of the projects that I was engaged with tended to describe individual cities. And there was a political conversation, and there were environmental conversations about the region, but they seemed to be siloed in their own channels. And so we took it several years ago, my colleagues and I, as a challenge, could we do something like Stalking Detroit, but beyond the scale of an individual city? And so the last thing that I'll say is, for me, it's been, my own challenge has been to try to use the tools of an urbanist to describe larger and larger impacts. Because I feel like the tools that I was given in my own training were very good at the set piece urban element, but at the scale and the pace that urbanization is happening, I find that we have to keep changing the scale of the frame that we're using. And so this is an attempt to do that.
Okay, so I want to follow up just one more before we get to the panel reactions to this. You have a publisher, and I imagine there were conversations about, well, who's going to buy this? So what is the demand for this? And do they think, and do you think that there's an audience that is hungering for a greater sense of the region, so that the kinds of issues that architects and landscape architects and urban designers can address in their careers can be done with a greater sense of regional identity? Where is that demand, and who's going to be buying this book?
Yeah, so we partnered again with Actar, the Barcelona and New York-based publishers who published Stalking Detroit. Initially, the reason that we did that first project with them was that we felt that with bringing photographers and editors and publishers from outside of Detroit, that they might have a different pair of eyes, different set of eyes. A part of their business model and a part of our position on the work has been to try to put together a coalition of funding, resources, a lot of unpaid labor, in order to produce something that can describe the region in a way without it needing to be a commercial project. And I don't want to overstate that, but the book is not free, but it also has been subsidized by the Grant Foundation, by the University of Illinois Chicago Provost Office, University of Toronto, Harvard GSD. And so we're producing it in a way in advance of any obvious demand. A part of what we say in the introduction is we feel that for our disciplines, because my day job is producing knowledge and producing disciplinary formation, even if there's no popular and/or professional need for this, on the disciplinary side, I feel like our disciplines need this. And so we situate this in a minor tradition of regional atlases. One of those was a book published a couple of years ago called Hyper Catalunya, which was describing Catalonia in the context of the political opening in Spain after Franco. As the Barcelona Olympics consolidated Barcelona as an urban design success, there was a conversation about regional autonomy. And so it's in that lineage. I'm hopeful that people in the region, both professionally and academically, will find it of value or of interest. But having said that, I don't want to presuppose that.
Okay. So now I want to turn to our panelists, Jen, Terry, Sean, ask you individually just to give us a few words about what this project means for your work. Are you excited about it? Where do you think this will lead you? Tell us what this is going to start for you and why you can't wait to get your hands on it.
Well, we are beyond excited for a number of reasons. It's a project that is very close to Maria and my heart because in some ways the essay that was included in this chapter also tracks the origins of our collaboration together. So in many ways it's been a really fortuitous starting point, but it's really exciting to see the work within the scope of amazing contributors and also within the structure of the book as Charles just laid out, which I find incredibly interesting because I think it does a really beautiful job of situating a kind of objective look at the region through tracking the historic maps and through measures and ways of thinking about the metrics of the region, interspersed with these really stunning photographs and subjective looks at the region, which is really the trajectory we've been trying to track in a much smaller way than what the book is beginning to accomplish. But I think it'll serve as a really compelling model for us to continue to work on building that bridge between a more quantitative way of thinking about climate and water and environment and a more qualitative way of building an identity of how we inhabit these spaces.
Well, sharing the first part and building a little bit more. As you all notice, I have quite a strong accent. So I come originally from Spain, from Europe. So for me, there is a dream moving to the States about engaging the regional and this tradition of regionalism in the States. That was the main reason why I first came to this country. So being part of a project that is in a way based in that specific premise and being able to contribute and to feel part of that larger conversation I would say has been an important, a very, very important part. It's also, just because it has been so long in the making, it has been a fantastic experience to little by little get to know many of the collaborators and much of the work that is now being displayed in the volume. And personally, in our case, it's been a tremendous opportunity to think through how we were first approaching the work. That was quite naively in this ambition of learning about the region by developing an atlas, by mapping a lot, by developing our own cartographies, and not at all that they were neutral cartographies, because we had very specific questions about water and urbanization. That was quite a kind of section for the very beginning. But it has allowed us enough time to go from the regional to the urban to the city, and then come back to the regional again. And I would say, after time working in this region, even thinking in a kind of federal project, because I think there is a larger ambition that goes beyond regionalism. We are dealing with almost federalism in this larger territory. And what are the many opportunities that this frontier territory still has? So seeing these historical maps is just exciting and in a way refreshing, because it's still how it feels like we are still in a project, in a continuous project of making and remaking.
Sure. I should have mentioned actually in my introductory comments that the subtext for all of our future city sessions is about informing practice. And so kind of the images that you saw tonight were the first time I think that we were seeing a lot of these as well. And I think that one of the things that feels the most important to me about this book, as is about our whole initiative, is how can we take sort of the best thinking coming out of academia and stream it into practice. So I'm really happy to see so many practitioners here tonight, as well as so many of our students who are the next wave of practitioners. We talk about what it means to practice urban design or architecture or landscape architecture in the Great Lakes region. But I think, as Charles so kind of accurately stated, that taking a moment to actually stop and describe the conditions that we're dealing with, and then making design decisions and making good choices based on our understanding of a shared hydrology could really change everything here. My piece in the book is different than what Sean and Maria and Jen wrote about in that, I was working on one of the city projects, and I don't mean to wave the flag for the whole city. There are lots of other opinions about what Cleveland means in a Great Lakes context. But the work we've been doing here for so long really looks at the way that hydrology and vacancy are correlated, in a really positive way. And even though there are other cities in the kind of older industrial conditions of the Great Lakes, there are other cities with more vacancy. Detroit, for instance. Here in Northeast Ohio, we have more site control, we've been doing land banking longer and better. That's a weird thing to be proud of, but there's so much kind of ground, so much land in the public realm that if we are going to be using the atlas as a prelude to the plan, Northeast Ohio and Cleveland may be the place where some of the most innovative planning ideas could roll out, because it's a public land bank, so we are public. We have the ability to really reshape and remake the city in a way that protects this resource that we're, responsible for.
Well, I guess as someone that's been, practicing in the region for a while now, the piece gave myself and my partner Karen Linsky, who couldn't be here because she has to teach, the ability to talk about something that I think that has become more and more important as people that really have been steeped in the basin for a long period of time. And primarily, I think that the two things are that there is, first and foremost, we spend time talking about vacant land, and Charles alluded to this a bit, but we have to get over this delusional idea that the Great Lakes is a place that's full of cities that are dying, and realize that we're it's a basin. We are growing in population rapidly, and the shorelines are privatizing rapidly, and wanted to figure out how we actually address that condition. Not that we do this series of kind of desperation-inspired responses to the fact that population is leaving, which tends to be I'm from Buffalo, so we're not quite where Cleveland is at the moment, and so we're still a developer shows up and wants to do something on the edge of the shoreline, and we're more than happy to let them do it tax-free. It's upsetting, and it should be for all of us. And so the first was to operate in that way, and the second was to realize that actually accessibility for the public to the shoreline is actually one of the most important things that we need to be doing. And trying to figure out, knowing that the region, and we can say there are exceptions like Chicago and Toronto, and actually at this point in time, even places like Milwaukee and Cleveland that have done a fantastic job of really doing a fair amount of work on the shoreline. But there are places you go to Toledo and you go to Saginaw, you go to Green Bay, and there are these towns that actually have huge resources and land that is in this moment of transition from one thing to the next. It's post-industrial. The cities that all at one point in time had their back turned to the lake are trying to figure out how to turn their face back to the lake. And how do we as designers actually engage that process is I think really what we were focused on, knowing that there's and situated in some of this, sorry, I could ramble on forever, so you can just tell me to be quiet, that this also is an incredibly dynamic region. I think so. There's the example, and I think I haven't read Jeff Mall's piece, and so I'm interested to see what it looks like. But there's actually a reality in some of those maps when you see when the French drew the maps, how weird the shoreline was. But actually, if you look at kind of geologically, how the lakes have evolved and devolved since the last glaciation. The reality is the lakes actually look that way in some cases, not what the French drew, but there's been that level of variation. In Saginaw, you can stand on the shoreline and realize that since humans of some form occupied the earth, that the lake shore has been 50 miles that direction and 50 miles that direction. And that we spend time trying to figure out how to stabilize this condition when it's actually one that is changing constantly. And we as designers need to figure out how to tackle that problem. And so I think that our piece is really trying to figure out how we as designers can maybe do that.
There's something to me that's very, thank you all. There's something very poignant about this exercise, and I think you'll understand what I'm trying to articulate if I just say, mention the American South. We know what that region is. It's grits and collards and Faulkner and the Civil War, and you know all of that stuff just like that. You don't have to ask, is this a region? Pacific Northwest, it's the same thing. We can go through all of those images, the Great American Desert, the Mountain West. Those regions have that kind of physical presence. Why is it, do you think, after Charles, the research that you've done here that's being assembled, and for the rest of the panel, why is it that we don't have that in this region? And part two of that is, why do you think we need it for what you're doing, for the project of figuring out the urban future of this region?
That's really interesting. It's not something I know that we understood when we embarked on the project. I think that it's been made clear, but just to amplify, my colleagues are being very generous. They agreed to kind of dive in and contribute to this thing. They had never seen the rest of the material. Had some sense of like who was involved, you know. And there is, again, there's something kind of perverse today about making a kind of 400-page physical atlas that we know will be obsolete. It's obsolete already. It's unprint. And so, being mindful of that, you did think that the function, at least in the way that Stock in Detroit worked, while Stock in Detroit was immediately obsolete in describing a condition at a moment in time, what it did for us was it gathered a conversation that continues to be productive for me to this day. A group of people who wouldn't otherwise be in the room, who wouldn't otherwise associate their research. And so it's interesting, you know, if you think about other regions and what it means to be a region, on the one hand, you know, for most of the 20th century, for maybe even earlier periods of time, we've been existing with a kind of lamentation in the design disciplines that political boundaries don't follow geologic boundaries, by and large. And that lamentation, especially in the US, is still with us. But for my purposes, I think it's important to say, and I think we say this in the book, that there are reasons why our political boundaries and our economic life and other things are not organized around hydrology. There's a very well-standing set of reasons why that's not the case. And so, unlike other projects, we're not, you know, proposing or imagining that there is a political restructuring or economic restructuring based on this geological revelation. And so, in that regard, our position on region is a kind of weak regionalism. But more to your question, Stephen, the idea that is there a value in describing the region in other terms? I think that there have been so many different ways in which the region has been characterized. And of course, the other history that's with us is, I think, much of the precedents we looked at, they tended to see the region as all bounty. It was all upside. You know, most of the history through the great heroic modernist planning projects of Doxiadis or Hilbersheimer, they imagined that, well, of course, the rational evidence of all this abundant fresh water will inevitably mean that we have this great opportunity for urbanization. And yet those projects, those theories, they tended to radically overstate the value of production, and they tended to radically underestimate consumption. And so we're in this funny moment, I find, in the region where, as has been mentioned, most often the narrative of the cities in the region is described as winners and losers. Toronto's doing great, it's got the film festival and economy. Oh, it's too bad about Toledo, huh? Yeah, I hope they pull out of it. And at the same moment, we felt as though that was kind of, well, maybe true, inadequate to describing the region. And so by beginning with this cartographic conceit and saying, well, there are problems, there are reasons why we're not organized politically as a region, is there a cultural value in doing so? And in that regard, we look at Quebec and Catalonia as finding a kind of autonomy, right? Both in Catalonia, I guess recently in Scotland, and certainly in Quebec, they always vote to 49.9% to leave. And I find that interesting, right? And so there's no obvious operative political project here, apart to say that I think that there are values in us describing what we share without calling it Rust Belt or without calling it flyover country. Is there another language that we could find? I don't know what the outcome of that will be, and I don't know that we'll all share the same literature or the same food. But certainly there's enough history here to suggest that we might benefit from talking to each other in a way. Of course, we already are, right? Of course, Buffalo talks to Ann Arbor, talks to Cleveland, of course. Of course, professionals engage in the region. But it strikes me as an opportune moment for us to be able to find our own language, our own terms, to be able to enter into that conversation. We are a consequential number of people, a consequential GDP, if you add us all up. If you look at it as a country in those regards, that's part of what we did in the book, is to say, well, even on its own terms, there might be this other narrative that wasn't simply the supply of fresh water or the abandonment of cities.
Anybody else like to take a crack at that? Why do we need to have a regional identity here in the Great Lakes?
This is a tough question to answer, but and this may not exactly be an answer, but one of the considerations that Maria and I have been grappling with in some of our work, our work veers wildly from large regional work, primarily supported through academic grants and funding and things like that, to incredibly small scale work that's client-based. So we do everything from these kind of regional mappings to playgrounds, depending on the day of the week, which is really exciting and really fun, but it means that in a way our mindset is sort of swinging from one set of concerns to the other. And a couple of the projects that we've been working on recently, one dealing with a vacant site in Detroit and working on a proposal for how it becomes a little performance music oral history stage as some kind of catalyst for that particular neighborhood, which has had an identity, doesn't have such an identifiable identity if you aren't from there right now. It's hard to see the things that people know who've been there for a long time, and projecting that forward, paired with a project that we've been working on dealing with the shoreline of Lake Michigan, and really just trying to produce simple drawings showing the dynamic qualities that the shoreline is an incredibly dynamic situation, which is in conflict right now with the way that legislation works in terms of building lot lines. So the way building lot lines are designated has to do with a very static elevation, and because the water is moving and the shore is moving, that elevation can shift laterally up to 150, 200 feet over a 10-year cycle. So of course, if you build your house the moment where that line is very close to the lake, there are problems 10 years from that. And so one of the conversations we've been having in both cases has to do with memory, which I think has to do something with this regional identity. And so on the one hand, the lake levels change very slowly for our own memories, decadally. So it's not like the coast where you've got the rise and the fall every day kind of reminding you that you're part of this larger system, which is a problem because it's easy to forget 10 years ago what things were like. And on the other hand, I think because of some of the dynamics of industrialization and the kind of shifts that we saw of urban patterns from the city centers to some of the metropolitan, also means that there's also a kind of loss of memory in the way that building fabric is being lost or reassembled. And I think that this is part of maybe the ongoing conversation about what is the identity. I didn't grow up in the Great Lakes, so this is a region that I'm coming to know, having worked and lived here now for, I guess, 20-ish years, but it was a real change in scale and a real change in material, like the landscape, the colors, the qualities of light, horizon, all of that is really different from the coasts. And so there is something very specific to it, but it's also a difficult thing to describe in precise terms.
It's nice. I thought you actually described it very precisely when you said something about the relative placidity of the lake edge condition, and I would add to that, it's kind of control through infrastructure and management that leaves us with a fairly benign image or a kind of relative static image. But it occurred to me that the lake survey that was commissioned in the 19th century, it described the interior lakes, their navigation, as far more dangerous than being in the open ocean. I mean, and so there's a whole set of conditions like that where the lakes have been constructed in a way, and that also masks a certain set of dynamic conditions. Now, lake shrinkage may not generate enormous federal funding tomorrow as a concern, but when you combine increased storm events and heat waves and populations that are really at risk, I think that there are a set of regional conversations to be had.
Yeah, I think maybe we ought to turn to our audience now and ask, yes, anybody has
My question, when you're talking about the regionalization, what do you think of the border, the country border of Canada and the United States going through it, and how that might have affected regionalization, as viewing it as one region, and also the history of that being the French-British sort of extending it into the country countries that are now there, I guess.
Sure, I think that that's a part of what we touch on in the book is that on the one hand, clearly, we start the region, the colonial, the European project of colonization with the genocide of pushing the native inhabitants out, and then immediately bring a French program of long lot, riverine-based survey and consolidation, both from the Mississippi but also from the St. Lawrence. And then it's along the larger geopolitical British-French, kind of conflict that we then end up with, following the Revolutionary War here in the War of 1812, a kind of fault line along which, those that were loyalists on the British Crown side retreated and were given lots just above the border. And so on the one hand, what we try to do is we try to thicken and complicate that. I think many authors historically and many projects have, as I said earlier, they've seen that as a kind of failure, as if, well, it's too bad the political boundary sits in the middle of the watershed, and I understand that. At the same time, I don't think there's any really plausible mechanism for undoing it. That's our history. And having said that, it means we have, incredibly different jurisdictions, cultural habits, economies. One brief anecdote, when I moved to Ontario with my family to go to Toronto, I convinced my family, my wife and young son at the time, that one of the reasons to move there was Canada was beautiful. And Sienna, my wife, had these incredible images of, the Thousand Islands, and the lakes, and the northern edge of this part of the world, which is lush and treed and beautiful. And it was precisely on that selling point that she agreed to come along. And we crossed the border, and we find that all of the arable land just north of the Canadian border has been denuded over and over again to make the only available farmland on that side. So there's all sorts of really interesting stories and histories there, obviously. Having said that, there has been a tendency in which we will try to depend upon multi-jurisdictional consortia, multi-jurisdictional, and of course, those are always, they tend to work well in times of peace, but as any jurisdiction can put a straw into the lakes and take water out, and now apparently some of them can sell that water outside the watershed. I think that there are those in the literature who argue for becoming water wars, which could either mean, wreak havoc along political boundaries, or it can mean that the region will engage in a new period of prosperity.
So I believe there's some restrictions on that, actually. There has to be, I have an anecdote from me. I have a friend in Ontario who's worried about nuclear plant storage along the shore, sort of going up Bruce Peninsula. And brainstorming about that, Lake Huron. And basically, I suggested the international strategy, and he started calling people in Michigan, and it became an international issue.
Any other questions?
So,
yes.
Go ahead. I'm just thinking about, first of all, I think it's so interesting, and as a documentation and taking my students to go look at a book, it was like my students had total panic that we were going into the library. So I appreciate that you can go to the library, get this book, but in 100 years from now, like I'm gonna care because I'm a pseudo-intellectual and I'm gonna care, but the practitioner, what's the goal? And maybe it's a spoiler alert, I don't know, but what do you hope that we'll get from this?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think others will have their own experience and their own practices. One of the subtexts in the book, which is a kind of recurring theme in my work and came up in Detroit originally, was that we exist in a political economy that has reached a kind of crossroads, I think. Like the way I was educated, right? If you're lucky to live in a democracy, you elect a mayor. The mayor appoints a political appointed director of planning. Planning has civil service kind of bureaucrats who orchestrate planning. At some point, urban design may be involved. At some point, the development community and landowners. And in that food chain, eventually you get to architects and maybe then to a landscape architect and kind of into that food chain. And that paradigm, I think, is under siege pretty strongly in most places that I work. And certainly in this region, that account is very hard to map onto what's actually happening here. And so whether it's in cities that are growing in population, cities that are stable, or cities that are declining, what we see is that design agency, or things like the CUDC, or design competitions, or design culture, they're occupying a very interesting status in many places that most often, or at least in many cases, projects in this part of the world don't go through traditional planning mechanisms. And without making a value judgment about that, I don't know what your experience in Cleveland has been, but in terms of being in practice, it changes the nature of the kinds of urban commissions people engaged in, right? That I know when I was in the region and ongoing, and many of my colleagues may share this, most often it's a combination of conceiving of the project from the grassroots up or from the top down, and also then sustaining that project and your own funding for it. And it's going to be more so than imagining that there is a pipeline of projects and then preparing oneself professionally for it. That's a bit of a generalization, but that's one of the things.
Next question? Do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to.
And remember, we have a panel here too, that please, other people can speak.
Well, looking at the presentation, it was almost a shock because there weren't political boundaries, and I think that that's part of it. It provides your atlas provides a new way, which really should be maybe the old way of looking at regions. Is how is their major resource organized? And humans always, from the very beginning, because they don't have a choice, have always organized around water and the water resource. And what makes this region uniquely identifiable is its massive surface water. It's not true that it holds 20% of the world's fresh water. It holds 20% of the world's surface fresh water. And that is not for nothing. It really makes a lot of things possible. And so your atlas provides really a new way of looking at this without the political boundaries. And I think I'll preface this by saying I was on one of the advisory committees for the Great Lakes Compact. And actually one of the things that we worry about is, well, okay, it's a compact now, how stable is that? And because it's a binational compact, although it's a compact, not a treaty, it effectively has the power of a treaty. And I think that makes it makes whatever change one might want to bring about, especially regarding its identifiable resource, water, surface water, it makes it much more, it makes any plan you would have to change that much more slower in its trajectory. If it were all one nation, local powers, I think would change that. We could opt to send water down to Arizona if Ontario and Quebec didn't have to agree to that, but they do. And so I think as a region, it maybe because it has that political boundary to it, it has become much more stable as a region.
And as many of the pieces in the book point out, it is relative to many other contexts, prosperous, peaceable economy is thriving in many contexts. So on the one hand, it's a glass half full, right? I mean, there was this one, is it in Wisconsin? Where's the jurisdiction that now recently has taken water outside?
It's in Wisconsin. Waukesha. So maybe the task of designers in this context is to connect us to the resource that we need to steward, the resource that's at the heart of our region, to be working across these mutable shorelines. And I'm just reflecting on all the design issues that I write about here, and how the general flatness of the region makes it hard to project the value of the proximity to water deep inland, so that one feels that one can see the water and feel like you're part of something bigger. But when you stand on the shoreline and look at it, and look at Lake Erie, which is I don't know, is it the smallest one?
Yeah.
Yeah, the smallest one.
Shallowest.
Yeah,
dirtiest,
smallest, shallowest,
most interesting.
warmest, deadest in the middle, all of that. And you think, this is amazing, this is an incredible thing, and it's just right over there. Yet we don't really think about it all the time, and maybe that's the problem.
Just one
yeah.
footnote on that. I think that's really well put, and for us, it resonates with what our editorial goals were. Often, in my experience in the region, Chicago, Toronto, Detroit, I don't know the situation here as well, but maybe you've had this experience. Most often, I find myself working in contexts that are not the center. And at the same moment, in most municipal conversations, it's always described or often in relationship to a center or a history, which is often described in municipal or civic terms. And I don't want to diminish that in any way. Of course, we have great Beaux-Arts histories, we have great histories in Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit. But a part of what we're trying to do here is to provide a context, other contexts in which those of us that are working in places that may not be relative to the center, so that you can describe a project in and around Cleveland as relating to what's going on down here downtown, but also in relationship to water more broadly, and to in a way give contexts, if not alibis, for doing work in different.
I think that's a great point, because you drive around the region and there's so many places where you can't get to the water, where the shoreline is owned, and that has to do with legal traditions that maybe we imported from New England, who knows. Any other questions? Yes, yes, please.
Did you guys give any thought or do any kind of study on the sort of impact of the rail and the rise of the rail system on the Great Lakes and water? I mean, it seems like just the lack of, not just the lack of water culture, but also the lack of water transportation, the lack of interconnectedness through the water, and how oftentimes you can't get to the water because there's a rail line there. That, like, the rail seems like it had a big impact on how we think about the region as a watershed. Did you guys look at that during maps, or did it come up in any of your?
It's a great point. I mean, there are a couple of ways it shows up in the book, in part in various essays. What seems clear to us is that the region was overwhelmingly riverine and lacustrine in terms of its navigation. Its transportation was water-based. And there was that moment of great enthusiasm and optimism eventually by the time you get to the west. So you look at the region's development, with the Erie Canal, clearly you have a kind of centrality to waterborne commerce and industry on the eastern edge of the eastern half of the region. So by the time you get to Chicago, right, the Illinois Michigan Canal, by the time it's cut, it's already obsolete, right, because rail has essentially replaced it. And the juxtaposition of rail, both passenger and freight, with the water infrastructure means that it makes the water infrastructure redundant and then locks it in certain ways. And as has been said, I mean, we're still dealing with that in many contexts. It's also clear in the work that airports come post-war very, very quickly after that. They also have a relationship to hydrology, they have a relationship to lake edge as well. And so transportation plays itself out in various ways. And at the same moment, overwhelmingly, the region is now automobile and truck-based, aviation-based. That seems unlikely to change. I don't see any evidence anywhere in the region to be optimistic about high-speed rail. There doesn't seem to be any credible, even after 8 years of Obama and a mandate, a kind of political program to build high-speed rail. I don't see any evidence that seems viable at all. But many cities, maybe Cleveland among them, is restructuring its land holdings. Toronto City Council just voted this week to approve a rail deck to finally cover with an enormous public park a huge rail yard right down by the waterfront. And so that work is still ongoing. I think it'll continue to take decades, but I think you're exactly right.
Any other? Oh, go ahead, please.
I would add that I think there's a more indirect connection as well. That's all true. I think the rail line, at least in Detroit, I don't know the water infrastructure in terms of treatment as well in other cities, but the rail line was so efficient at supporting growth, really rapid growth associated with the auto industry, that in the case of Detroit, and I think other cities were in the same situation, they reached a real critical crisis in terms of having all the workers and the houses and the waste from industry forced them to basically it was almost like a shovel-ready project, take a kind of water infrastructure, sewage infrastructure that was already available and ready to build. And so they literally kind of took drawings from combined sewer systems in the UK at the time and just implemented it as quickly as possible to kind of catch up with the fact that the city was just like way out in front of the infrastructure. And of course, we're still dealing with that legacy. CSOs are a major part of water quality issues throughout the region. So it's not quite as direct, but I think the rail lines have something to do with that story as well.
Another relationship between water and mobility. I think it's an open question, especially in this region. Is there a greener future for automobility or not? I think that's obviously debated in a lot of places, but the region is not characterized in relative terms with an abundance of either solar potential or wind. It has some of both, but compared to other parts of the world, other parts of North America, it's neither optimal for either of those. And so, on the one hand, there have been those arguing that in this region, among others, post-carbon, post-greenhouse gas future for renewables will suggest a collapse of automobility. All the indications that I see, all the evidence that I find suggests automobility will continue at pace. And the question is, will there be some form of non-carbon-based automobility? If so, what impact will that have? How will the energy be produced? Where will it come from? These are the kinds of things that will implicate water in the region.
Well, I want to thank everyone. I think this has been a fantastic beginning of a conversation, and there's so many avenues that I think this could take. I know everyone here on the panel is going to be working on those, and probably everyone else in the room. So I want to thank everyone, and then hand this back to Terry for any concluding remarks.
My only remark is to thank all of you for coming and to thank our panelists for spending the evening with us. So thank you very much.